This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with artist Hernan Bas. Bas is a Miami-based rising star in the art world, whose large-scale figurative paintings typically feature scenes of young men doing curious things. These paintings have most recently taken the form of imagined conceptual artists honing their craft, which were on view at Lehman Maupin in New York, titled The Conceptualists, Volume 2. And now, a conversation about conceptual curiosities with artist Hernan Bas. Thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Hernan, a lot of times with artists, I love to start with a hypothetical, which is if you were sitting at a dinner party next to a stranger who had no idea who you are or what your work looks like or what it consists of, where do you even start to explain to them what your work is?
It's a tricky question. I mean, if it's like it's difference between like it being like an actual like art quote unquote dinner party, or if it's like a regular dinner party. Like if it's a regular dinner party, I always just like to say I'm a painter, and if people ask me like, oh, what brand of paint do you use, Sherwin-Williams or something, and like I'll just go in that direction because I don't like the typical like conversation that occurs when you tell somebody, oh, I'm an artist. Like 9 out of 10 times they ask you, what kind of work do you do? And then they usually ask you, oh, can you paint a portrait of my kid for me? And then how much does that cost? And it becomes this nightmare, conversation that you don't want to have anything a part of. But that said, I think when people ask me what kind of work I make, I definitely say I'm a painter still, but I think I usually say that my work basically starts with like being a very curious person. Like I like basically like sharing things that I find interesting with the public, and hopefully they find something interesting in it too that they can basically go off and Google themselves. So I like to open the door with my work into sort of really weird esoteric worlds that maybe people aren't aware of, and hopefully they walk away from it and spark some kind of curiosity in themselves as well, maybe. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, I think it does. I think it opens the door into, I think I'm hearing there that you're a collector of curiosities. Would you agree with that?
I would definitely agree with that. I think it's been my sort of life's journey to collect curiosities, whether it's ideas or stories or literally objects, in my case. That's definitely spot on.
And so how do those curiosities wind up finding their way into your work?
It's always tricky because I always start with an idea, and not often do like the actual objects make it into the work. It's sort of what they inspire. So oftentimes if I'm making a work about sort of a specific realm or moment of interest, I guess you could say, like let's say I'm like thinking about like Bigfoot for some reason, like I don't immediately go out and buy like some casts of Bigfoot prints, which I have a couple anyway. I usually like think it's an idea first, and then I start collecting as I start researching more and more into that little world that I'm involved in at the moment. I'll start finding these objects and I'll literally start collecting them for my own collection as a result of that research. Like usually the research comes first, and then me as a collector brain pops in and like, oh, I want to have that now.
Those curiosities, are the inspirations on the level of creating a world or a space for a narrative? Is there always a clear narrative in your work?
It's getting a little more esoteric or obscure as of late because of the series I'm working on in particular. But I try to make things that are relatively relatable because I when I walk into a show, I don't want to be completely lost either, So I am really conscious of that in terms of when people look at a work, like I don't want them to have to like, pick up an encyclopedia to figure out what's going on in the painting. But at the same time, I want them to be curious about like, well, what does that mean? And especially when you throw in a title, usually, which I'm really fond of titles in general. I think they're important. I've never really untitled anything in my life. But I wanted to spark a sort of weird interest or curiosity about what's going on in the work. And one of the things I always say about my work is I always try to find these obscure things that if you eventually end up reading about it or Googling it itself, my painting will be the first thing that pops up on a Google search when you type in XXX. That's sort of my goal in life, is like to be the top hit on these really obscure things when you do an image search, which is really fun. Sort of test for myself. I know that sounds weird. Like my life's goal is to be the first image search for like weird random things on the internet, but it's actually happened a few times, which is really exciting.
It reminds me, I mean, a topic that comes up time and again on the podcast is an artist's attempt to maintain ambiguity. Mm-hmm. Viewers don't necessarily appreciate being spoon-fed ideas in my mind. And so they seem to enjoy the sense of discovery. And mm-hmm. Is that something you think about in your work? Having an idea, having a narrative, but also keeping things open-ended enough that there is discovery and people are able to insert themselves?
I think with figurative work, people are always in some way looking to insert themselves in it, no matter what. I think I've found that, at least with my experience. And especially like being a gay artist, like by chance, I don't consider that a huge aspect of my work, to be honest. Like it might have been earlier on in my career, but these days it's not like a crucial element of what I do anymore, to be honest. Like it's just sort of it just happens to be a little funny, quote unquote. But I found that like a lot of people do want to insert themselves in the work, especially when it's figurative. And my goal isn't to necessarily like provide a stage for them to see themselves. That's not really my goal. It's a matter of discovering someone or some character that you haven't met before. So I want these characters to be someone that has never existed on the planet necessarily. And like, in a weird way, like, would you be friends with them? It's kind of a silly way to think about your own work. But for me, I grew up wanting to be a writer when I was really young, more so than an artist. And when I abandoned that sort of thing, I think I kept that a bit of that need to create characters. It's really kind of essential to my paintings in general, I think.
A lot of your work, especially in this series, kind of features lone figures. And even in the paintings that have multiple figures, there's this Edward Hopper sort of feel that the subjects are alone together, which kind of conveys alienation to me. And is that a sense of alienation something that is consciously in your work, or is that just baggage I'm bringing to my interpretation?
I think it's a good read, and it's in the work. It's hard to avoid it because it's most, like, I would say 90% of the time it's a single soul figure. And I think that's generally intentional for me, at least, because I want it to be about that one person, that one character. Like when you're reading a novel, or whether you're reading or watching a movie or something, like really the main character is the end all of everything at the end of the day. So if I'm thinking about Catcher in the Rye, like, can you name another character in the book? You can't really, it's all about Holden. So for me, that's definitely part of the narrative. A lot of people think that they're automatically sad, and especially when they find out that the artist is gay, like they always read into it as being like this sort of tragic gayness, which I think is kind of gotten annoying to some extent to me. And on the other end, like if I have more than one character ever in a painting, they automatically assume it's a couple. Like that's another thing that kind of drives me crazy to some extent. Like it's like, doesn't necessarily mean that they're a couple, It's just two people. Like, I mean, and if it's like three gay guys, it's three guys in the painting, doesn't mean it's a throuple, It's
right.
It's just characters. So that can be a little frustrating at times.
I know that a lot of times when people talk about your work, they talk about this gay undercurrent. I mean, is that conscious on your part, or is your work just a reflection of who you are?
I think it just happens naturally. I did this lecture a while ago at the ICA in Miami, and I posed the question to the audience, like, what makes this work gay necessarily? And someone just said it was a sensibility. And I was like, well, I guess that's a good answer, because like I can't really pinpoint it myself. And I don't know if it's just because there's occasionally some peacocks in there, or, that men are attractive. Like, I don't know what exactly that sensibility is that people are talking about. But it's weird because I don't see the work as being that gay. Like, and so it's very strange to me that it's automatic almost that people sense that in the work.
I wonder if it has something to do with the young men you portray, because they all seem to have a particular demographic. There's a certain age, a certain type. I mean, tall, slender, white, early 20s, piercing blue eyes. Is it something about that particular portrayal, especially in groupings? I mean, is it... I guess we really don't know, because it sounds like it's really not something conscious, but in something that people really can't put their finger on, right?
Right. I think there's always a jump to for people as well, that when you portray someone that's sort of fragile and not like the male ideal that I had to grow up with Abercrombie and Fitch and the Bruce Weber photos, like later in my life, luckily I grew up with like the complete opposite, which was like the heroin chic moments of, that whole hot was like the skinny, like emaciated dude, So by the time I was in high school, like being super like skinny dude was like cool and hip in some weird way. And that sort of old ideal of masculinity had kind of gone away a tiny bit, at least. So for me, I think people ask me like, why are the figures always like that? Like, A, it's like, maybe it's just what I'm attracted to personally. Like, B, it's also like, it was just literally reflecting myself. Like I was that skinny twink, quote unquote, back in the day. So it was me painting me, like just with a prettier face, So
I hear people sometimes compare your portraiture to Elizabeth Peyton. I think I understand what people are trying to reference there, but there's so much more going on in your work than a typical Elizabeth Peyton painting, right? I mean, your work isn't just about pure portraiture. It's not about a headshot. There's a large amount of concept going on. This current show that's up at Lehman Maupin is referred to as the Conceptualists. It's volume 2. It's a continuing body of work. That comparison to Elizabeth Peyton, is that something you've heard a few times?
A couple of times, let's put it that way. I like Elizabeth's work a lot. I just don't make the same kind of work in my brain, because for me, it's like you said, I have to have an idea behind. There has to be a narrative. Like I could sit around and paint pretty boys all day, and the work would probably do just as well as it's been doing for a while now. But that doesn't interest me. That doesn't excite me. And I'm sure Elizabeth has conceptual notions that she's working with that maybe people aren't reading into enough as well. But for me, I start with lists of phrases and lists of titles, and the painting is almost an after effect, like of whatever I'm doing. Like, at my core, I think of my work as being conceptual in nature, and people are always confused by that because it's about, it's a pretty painting. Like, but for me, the ideas are well and above more interesting than the actual physical paintings half the time. Like, as far as I'm concerned, like by the time I get to the actual physical painting, it's fun for me to paint. Like, I like the actual act of painting, but it's all just a matter of me translating this idea that I want to share. Like, that's my end goal. Like, I think Elizabeth's work, for example, is so central in the way that she paints, and that's very much part of that work in my brain. Like, so I think that's sort of, for me, a separation in a sense. Like, I think I'd make more sense from someone to compare me to Karen Kelnick in that sense, and other artists who I've been compared to in the past, and I don't mind. Let's put it that way.
Another point of conversation that's come up a few times on the podcast is utilizing beauty or utilizing detail or the number of things in a painting to invite a viewer to stop and linger and consider things more closely. It's like it's almost being used as a tool. In my mind, you utilize that in your work, especially some of like one of the series prior to the Conceptualists. I mean, there's just almost horror oculi, just spaces filled with so much stuff, so many of those collected curiosities. Is that a tool that you're using to invite people to slow down?
Absolutely. I think for me, there's an aspect, I hate using this reference, but I use it all the time. There's sort of a Where's Waldo aspect to the paintings, that I want to trap people, and like they can kind of like do the math, like this thing in the corner plus this plus that equals a narrative that I didn't catch immediately. So that for me is definitely something I'm very conscious of, and I like doing it. For me, it's fun. I'll even put in like sort of visual gags that only I'll kind of realize are there at the time, but occasionally some people catch them. But yeah, with the Conceptualist series, it was particularly hard because you're trying to relate the character of a person who doesn't exist and their entire art practice, basically. So you have to add a lot into these paintings to sort of give people the clue of what the entire universe that this artist is functioning in is based around. So just having that space around the figure to give those visual clues, it's kind of the funnest part of this whole series for me in general. Because I like to have fun in the studio at the end of the day. Like, so I'm here all the time, so might as well make myself laugh sometimes.
For the person that shows up to the show, the Conceptualists, how would you describe the overarching concept behind this continued series?
So the Conceptualists for me all started out with me realizing around the time of the lockdowns and everything during the pandemic that the paintings I was making at the time, these characters were up to these weird, sort of bizarre activities that if you looked at them, you kind of question, like, why are they doing this? Like, what's wrong with this person, in a sense? So for me, in order to give these characters a sense of cover, I like to call it, if you take that same activity, but then call it a conceptual artist, then it's okay. Like, they can do these weird things that might be judged by society, but if you call them a conceptual artist, then it's okay. And so that was sort of the impetus for the entire series in general. And from there, it just became a sort of runaway adventure for me to come up with all these different characters and really have fun with not just the history of conceptual art, but the history of art in general, and just different characters in general, and the obscure things they might like, and the weird worlds they created for themselves. Like, because especially during lockdown, people, they all found themselves sort of becoming conceptual artists in a weird way. Like, you were forced to make your own little worlds. And so for the first time, these characters, I feel like, are confident, as opposed to these sort of works that in the past where the characters seemed a little fragile or frail or hiding in the shadows to some extent. So I wanted to give them that liberty and just basically be freaks, but under the cover and guise of being conceptual artists.
The work, it kind of reminds me of this TED Talk I saw one time by this artist named Shea Embry. The TED Talk was called How I Became 100 Artists, and he had decided to create a fictional biennial, and then he created the work in the biennial of 100 different artists. And so he created their names, he created these elaborate backstories for each artist, and then based on who they were, created different conceptual work. It sounds like there's a bit of a writer in you. Have you gone so far as to like name these artists and they have a backstory? And how much do you know about them other than this one event that we're in the middle of seeing?
I wish I'd seen that story, because I've never heard of him, and now I want to look it up immediately. But besides that, I have spent so much time with these characters that, depending on the artist, some more than others, I've invented elaborate life stories in my brain. Like, I rarely like write them down as fictions per se, but there's so much space there to think about these kind of characters. Like, there's this one of the conceptual artists, not in the show at Lehman Maupin, but shown last year in October in London, and his works, I forget the exact title, but his work centered around performance work centered around acts of discomfort. So in the painting, he's enacting a performance where he's pretending to be the pea in The Princess and the Pea, like stacked underneath a ton of mattresses, and he comes out of the mattress every now and then and eats a single pea as a performance piece. But I thought about, like, what are the other ways that he could cause like discomfort socially as a performance? Like, so I imagined him like standing in the supermarket, like in the fruit section, and just slowly squeezing fruit until he's asked to leave, or standing in the checkout line, like with a giant jar of pennies, like waiting to pay, like that kind of, these weird like moments of discomfort. So I kept elaborating like in my brain about all these different moments. So some of the characters give me a lot more life to them, like after the fact. Some of them I could have made an entire show just on that one artist and, multiple paintings of his different works. But I wanted to focus on one seminal sort of work per artist for this entire series. So far I've made, I think it's close to 30 conceptualists paintings, and all 30 of them are individual artists, like not overlapping each other at all. And to answer the other question, I have not named them because it's weird to name them for me. It has to be sort of just ambiguous. It could be anybody. That's why they're all called a conceptual artist, number blank, conceptual artist blank, conceptual artist number blank.
Right.
And it kind of falls in line with the traditions of the way people talk about conceptual art as well. Like there's this sort of coldness involved when people relate to conceptual art. So that was important for me too. And also with the titles as well. I don't like to rely on titles too much, but some of these are some of the longest titles I've ever made for individual paintings. But again, conceptual art, a lot of it, you wouldn't know what you're looking at until you read the titles. So I feel like it was fitting for this series to have the titles be really important to the works. Like one of my favorite artworks ever is Felix Gonzalez Torres' two clocks. They're the two school clocks butted up against each other. And if you're in a museum and you walk in and it's like, oh, there's these two clocks, they're set at the exact same time on the wall. And you're like, what am I looking at? And then so you read the title, which is Perfect Lovers, so it's that kind of romanticism of conceptual art is also a big part of the series as well.
So incredibly clever because you've created a vehicle where you can continue pursuing your signature style of painting while also exploring a wide array of conceptual ideas. I mean, it's a little meta because in the end, each of these artists are really serving as a proxy for you, right?
Yeah, I've had the word meta in my brain more in the last 2 years than I have probably in my lifetime. Like there's so many things that just overlap and like create like varying degrees of confusion in my brain that it's been one of the funnest series I've ever made for myself because it is really a way for me to turn into a conceptual artist over the last 2 years. And not that all of the work that these artists that I'm portraying or creating make spectacular work. That's not really even the point. It's the fact that I can explore in a completely other avenue than painting and literally take myself outside of the studio, like into a field and like cast pumpkin heads and like weird stuff like that.
My impression is that it also allows you to explore some things with your materials, right? Can you describe the one of the artists with the Polaroid camera sitting in the dairy section at the grocery store?
Right.
And, just can you kind of describe that? Because it's my understanding that you've done some things in terms of execution that are kind of homage to, we see this in multiple paintings, I believe, homage to different artists in terms of techniques, right?
Techniques or even just sentiment in a sense. I did I'll start with the milk carton painting. That was a kind of a challenging one for me. It's called Conceptual Artist. I think it's number, let's say 20. But the title is A Child of the 80s. He places his Polaroid self-portraits in familiar places whenever he's feeling lost. And that title is almost not even clear enough unless you look at the painting in this instance. Because in the painting, the figure is sitting on the floor in front of these a row of glass door refrigerator cases in a supermarket, holding a Polaroid camera, taking a self-portrait, and one of his Polaroids of himself is taped to a milk carton on his to his side on the floor. And the whole impetus behind that was me being really enthralled with the idea of the milk carton kids from the 80s, which I'm sure you seem like you might be old enough to remember this. Like
I am.
So when I was a kid, like I was traumatized by like finding a missing photo of a child on a milk carton, like when I'm trying to just have breakfast and go to school. Like, am I going to come home that day? So, and it's a really touchy subject, but for me, that's why I said whenever he's feeling lost, like instead of whenever he's missing, because I didn't want to go too deep into that world. So just the idea of him taking a Polaroid of himself whenever he's feeling lost, putting it on a milk carton, and then returning it back to the shelf for someone to find later as this sort of romantic gesture of feeling like he could be found again, like in some romantic, poetic kind of way, was really fun for me. But even just the aesthetics of the painting, it's sort of a flat perspective. So all the milk cartons in the cases are silk screened a la Warhol. The Polaroid he's holding is, of course, a Warhol reference because, we all know he loved himself a Polaroid. And coincidentally, I modeled the figure's body after a photograph I took of myself because the position was weird to sort of invent. And I happened to be wearing these Warhol socks at the time that I took the photo of myself that were prints. The sock print was of Warhol's skull paintings, like the death sort of skulls. And I thought, well, that kind of works in this situation in a weird, kind of messed up way. But so I just had decided to keep it in the painting. And so, yeah, I like putting those kind of references in. I've always been a huge fan of Warhol, but even within the same show at Lehman Maupin, there's a painting of men engaged in a pillow fight, and that composition is loosely based on those famous George Bellows boxing paintings, like the one famously at the Whitney that's always up. So I like making those sort of vague references that. It also is a way for people to feel familiar with the painting. Like, oh, why does this look familiar? And it, in a weird way, it's also comforting. Like if you're doing something that's a little challenging, like boys pillow fighting, like people might find it pervy at first in some weird way. But then, if you think of it in the terms of art history and Bellows and all these sort of niceties, then it becomes somewhat acceptable. I don't know if that makes sense, but
the reference to Warhol opens up a window to include silk screening. I'd read an article where there's an upcoming piece that's not in the show where you were going to be creating one of an artist who works in creating headstones out of suet bricks. And so you were talking about trying to find the right consistency for what appears to be suet and casting that texture. And so again, it kind of opens up a way to extend your practice beyond the normal concept of brush to canvas, right?
Yeah, I think that's part of me trying to have fun in the studio still, because after a while, brush to canvas to me got kind of boring, especially when you're involving so much narrative that becomes sort of the predominant thing when you're looking at the painting. But for me, I need to have a little bit more excitement when I'm making something. So I love experimenting with a bunch of different materials and pigments and stamping. Like with the bird suet thing, for example, I've been using or starting to use these silicon flat molds that people use for like decorating fondant cakes. And I wish I discovered it earlier, because that painting I mentioned earlier with the stacks of mattresses, instead of using this fondant pattern that I found for sale on Amazon that's exactly mimics like the mattress, the side of an old classic mattress, I like literally had to wet like the side of a fabric mattress and like stamp it into the painting instead of using something really easy that was available on Amazon. So I don't always find the easiest route, but now I'm sort of starting to figure out these methods that are a lot more practical. But experimenting with that kind of stuff is almost more for me in a way than anybody else. Like I think it's interesting for people to see that in the work as well, the different textures and all that sort of layering in the painting. But for me, that's just part of keeping it interesting for me as a painter in the studio.
As I look through the images of the show, like each one just invites me to just linger and try to figure out exactly what all's going on. And they're beautifully crafted. Like right now on my computer, I'm looking at one of someone who appears to be maybe paper making from old romance novels.
Right.
Well, what's going on with that one?
That one, part of the series with the Conceptualists was, for me, was having fun with taking these art practices that are typically considered not fancy or fine art, I guess you could say, like paper making or popsicle stick sculpture or ice sculpting or sand sculpting. And how do you take those sort of, I don't know what the right word to use would be, but like, how do you elevate that into pretentious world of art, and not just craft? So a lot of the time, a lot of these characters have that aspect of like turning something that's not considered fine art into something admirable to the art world because there's some conceptual twist to it. So in the case of the books, I was thinking about someone who makes pulp paper, very simple homemade like pulp paper, but how do you elevate that to something that's fine arty and conceptual? So this character makes pulp paper out of Pulp Fiction, like which I thought was just funny and clever, but also there's again opens the door. Like, I mean, I can imagine like him shredding romance novels, making paper out of it, and like, do you use that paper to write a love letter? Do you use it to write another romance novel? Like it has that open endedness to it that I also really liked. I also had a really good time like silk screening all the titles for all these old romance novels that are in the background. Like I happen to have like a giant box of romance novels in my studio from a project I never did years ago, and I finally was like, what am I going to do with all of these things? So the titles are hysterical. It's like Christina Comes to Town, like,
Oh my
like
gosh.
weird like romance novel names. But yeah, so I think that touches on a bit of the humor too that a lot of these conceptual artists have. I hope people laugh when they see the show to some extent, because if there's any form of art that merits the most laughter, or at least garners the most laughter, it's conceptual art. Like it is the go-to joke in terms of when people who don't know about art want to make fun of it, they go straight to conceptual art. It's
Right.
like the easiest target. Like used to be abstract expressionism, but now it's conceptual art. Maybe performance. It's right on the edge there. Like, they kind of overlap. So.
Do you feel like this is a series that can continue to go into more and more volumes, or do you feel like there are other ideas creeping in that don't necessarily fit this model? Where do you think you're headed?
I'm sort of starting to wrap up the series for the year, basically. They're all going to be shown together in an exhibition later this year. Hasn't been announced yet, but so for me, I think I'm about 6 or 7 artists out from finishing for the time being, and the last painting for now of the Conceptualist series is going to be sort of the Puppet Master at the end of the hallway, which is going to be a massive painting, and the painting will be titled "A Conceptual Artist Who Exclusively Paints Portraits of Other Conceptual Artists Who Never Existed." So it's sort of going full circle with the whole series, and it's not a portrait of me, but I'm another imagined conceptual artist, but the background of the painting will be a very classic artist studio that has elements of all the other artists' works that have been in the series thus far. So there'll be drawings, sketches from all the other paintings, objects from the other paintings, all in a same sort of Where's Waldo way that I like to work within the setting of this studio that I'm creating for the sort of what do they call him in the Wizard of Oz? The Great and Powerful Oz,
Right.
I call it Puppet Master, I guess, but
Right.
different sort of thing. But yeah,
The great and powerful Bas, right?
I mean, that's sort of back to meta. That's sort of the full circle meta of this entire series in a way.
In this show at Lehman Maupin, there are 12 of these pieces, and they're pretty big. I mean, they're like roughly 6 foot squared. A lot of content, and I was surprised to learn that you're going at this alone. That you work in a studio by yourself. I mean, just the ability to turn out that much square footage of painting on your own is really impressive. I mean, is it important to you to maintain this practice alone on your own?
I definitely like being alone in the studio. Let's put it that way.
Right.
I don't really like having people around in general. Like when I'm working, it's just such a private thing to me. And also the way I work, like I don't see how anyone could help me. Like I don't make work that could be aided in any way. Like it's not like, oh, you can fill in this color field over here for me, and or stick this on there for me. Like it's nothing about my work. I feel like, I mean, it's like Cecily Brown. Can you imagine Cecily Brown having someone painting on her paintings? I mean, that just doesn't happen.
No.
Like, it just makes no sense. So for me, I'm the same way. I just don't see how that would function for me as a working artist. On top of liking being, by myself. I also have some really annoying studio habits, which I don't think people would be too keen to be around for all the time. Like I have a TV on all the time in the studio. Like that's my white noise, like in the background all the time. And I watch a lot of bad television. Like, well, depending on who you ask, is bad. Like it's not like reality TV. Well, it's kind of reality TV because it's like bad ghost hunting shows or like that kind of paranormal crap that I've been into for way too long.
So what you really need is a curiosity channel. which I guess
it's called the Travel Channel these days, like the
right,
quote unquote history channel. Like,
right.
ancient aliens, my God, like that's history now. Like,
Have ancient aliens found their way into your work before?
no, I'm yet to find a way. It's when you're dealing with these occult subject matters that I've always been interested in, it's really hard to actually make a painting that's interesting about them. Like the only times I've made paintings about the UFO phenomenon, I can count maybe one or two in my brain. One of them was a portrait of a guy named I called the Gulfstream hoaxer, who was a guy who hoaxed a famous ghost, but I mean not ghost, a famous UFO sighting in Gulf Breeze, Florida. So I did a portrait of him in his backyard with like the strings and the fake UFO hanging behind him and Christmas lights and stuff. But I'm still to this day have gone through almost all of what you consider the paranormal encyclopedia in terms of all the weird things you can think of, or genres, whether it's ghosts, poltergeists, UFOs, the whole gamut of it, like psychic abilities, all that stuff. But the one thing I can't find a way to make a painting about is Bigfoot. There's just no way to make a good Bigfoot painting that is, to me, interesting in any way possible.
Well, just, kind of workshopping this.
Yeah.
What if Bigfoot, instead of imagining that Bigfoot was real, that he's actually the product of a conceptual artist who's been working for 50 years out in the wild, wearing his, giant prosthetic feet and, never needing the notice of a real human. But I don't know. There's bound to be some way we can find Bigfoot, in here somewhere.
You nailed it, because that's like the only approach I've thought of. I actually own a pair. It's been in my collection in the cabinet just to the left of me of fake Bigfoot like shoes you can strap on like to your shoes and walk around making fake Bigfoot prints. So that's the only way I can sort of imagine doing a character. It would be someone faking Bigfoot, basically, because
sure,
if I were to just to straight up paint Bigfoot, like I wouldn't want to see that painting.
Right. Well, I mean, you think about it. There are, the hoaxer you were talking about earlier. The person with the fake Bigfoot feet. The people doing the crop circles. I mean, they're all in a way akin to your conceptual artist, right?
Yeah, it's the same world to me. I mean, it's not a far stretch from Mauricio Catalan to crop circles in my brain. There's an aspect to pranksterness that it's very embedded in conceptual art as well, I think. So I definitely like playing with that aspect of it too.
Hernan, I really appreciate your time. I'm going to have links to images from the show, the Conceptualists Volume 2. It's really captivating work, and I really appreciate you sitting down and being willing to talk to me all about it.
Thanks so much for having me, Craig. I appreciate it.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to ArtSense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to Cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.